Chapter 12 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 12. Sabbath at the Diggings. Larry O'Neil takes to wandering and meets with adventures. An Irish Yankee discovered. Terrible calamities befall travellers on the overland route. There is no country in our fallen world, however debased and morally barren, in which there does not exist a few green spots where human tenderness and sympathy are found to grow. The atmosphere of the gold regions of California was, indeed, clouded to a fearful extent with the soul-destroying vapours of worldliness, selfishness, and ungodliness, which the terrors of Lynch law alone restrained from breaking forth in all their devastating strength. And this is not to be wondered at, for Europe and America naturally poured the flood of their worst inhabitants over the land, in eager search for that gold, the love of which, we are told in sacred writ, is the root of all evil. True, there were many hundreds of estimable men, who, falling from adverse circumstances to make a livelihood in their native lands, sought to better their fortunes in the far west; but in too many cases the gold fever which raged there soon smote them down, and men who once regarded gold as the means to an end, came at last to esteem gold to be the end, and used every means, fair and foul, to obtain it. Others there were, whose constitutions were proof against the national disease, whose hearts deemed love to be the highest bliss of man, and doing good his greatest happiness. But stilling and destructive though the air of the gold mines was, there were a few hardy plants of moral goodness which defied it, and some of these bloomed in the colony of Little Creek. The Sabbath morning dawned on Ned Sinton and his friends, the first Sabbath since they had begun to dig for gold. On that day the miners rested from their work. Shovel and pick lay quiet in the innumerable pits that had been dug throughout the valley. No cradle was rocked, no pan of golden earth was washed. Even reckless men had come to know from experience that the Almighty, in his goodness, had created the Sabbath for the special benefit of man's body as well as his soul, and that they wrought better during the 6 days of the week, when they rested on the 7th. Unfortunately, they believed only what experience taught them. They kept the Sabbath according to the letter, not according to the spirit; and although they did not work, they did not refrain from thinking their own thoughts and finding their own pleasure on God's holy day. Early in the morning they began to wander idly about from hut to hut, visited frequently the grog shops, and devoted themselves to gambling, which occupation materially marred even the physical rest they might otherwise have enjoyed. "Comrades," said Ned Sinton, as the party sat inside their tent round the napkin on which breakfast was spread, "it is long since we have made any difference between Saturday and Sunday, and I think it will be good for us all if we were to begin now. Since quitting San Francisco, the necessity of pushing forward on our journey has prevented our doing so hitherto. How far we were right in regarding rapid travelling as being necessary, I won't stop to inquire, but I think it would be well if we should do a little more than merely rest from work on the Sabbath. I propose that, besides doing this, we should read a chapter of the Bible together as a family, morning and evening, on Sundays. What say you?" There was a pause. It was evident that conflicting feelings were at work among the party. "Perhaps you're right," said Maxton. "I confess that I have troubled myself very little about religion since I came out here, but my conscience has often reproached me for it." "Don't you think, messmates," said Captain Bunting, lighting his pipe, "that if it gets wind, the whole colony will be laughing at us?" "Sure they may laugh," said Larry O'Neil, "and after that they may cry, if it'll do them good. What's the differ to us?" "I don't agree with you, Ned," said Tom Collins, somewhat testily. "For my part, I like to see men straightforward, all fair and above board, as the captain would say. Hypocrisy is an abominable vice, whether it is well meaning or ill meaning, and I don't see the use of pretending to be religious when we are not." "Tom," replied Ned, in an earnest voice, "don't talk lightly of serious things. I don't pretend to be religious, but I do desire to be so. and I think it will be good for all of us to read a portion of God's Word on His own day, both for the purpose of obeying and honouring Him, and of getting our minds filled, for a short time at least, with other thoughts than those of gold hunting. In doing this there is no hypocrisy." "Well, well," rejoined Tom, "I'll not object if the rest are agreed." "Agreed," was the unanimous reply. So Ned rose, and, opening his portmanteau, drew forth the little Bible that had been presented to him by old Mr Shirley on the day of his departure from home. From that day forward, every Sabbath morning and evening, Ned Sinton read a portion of the Word of God to his companions, as long as they were together, and each of the party afterwards, at different times, confessed that, from the time the reading of the Bible was begun, he felt happier than he did before. After breakfast they broke up, and went out to stroll for an hour or two upon the wooded slopes of the mountains. Ned and Tom Collins went off by themselves; the others, with the exception of Larry, walked out together. That morning Larry O'Neil felt less sociable than was his wont, so he sallied forth alone. For some time he sauntered about with his hands in his pockets, his black pipe in his mouth, a thick oak cudgel of his own making under his arm, and his hat set jauntily on one side of his head. He went along with an easy swagger, and looked particularly reckless, but no man ever belied his looks more thoroughly. The swagger was unintentional, and the recklessness did not exist. On the contrary, the reading of the Bible had brought back to his mind a flood of home memories, which forced more than one tear from his susceptible heart into his light blue eye, as he wandered in memory over the green hills of Erin. But the scenes that passed before him, as he roamed about among the huts and tents of the miners, soon drew his thoughts to subjects less agreeable to contemplate. On week days the village, if we may thus designate the scattered groups of huts and tents, was comparatively quiet, but on Sundays it became a scene of riot and confusion. Not only was it filled with its own idle population of diggers, but miners from all the country round, within a circuit of 8 or 10 miles, flocked into it for the purpose of buying provisions for the week, as well as for the purpose of gambling and drinking, this being the only day in all the week in which they indulged in what they termed a spree. Consequently, the gamblers and storekeepers did more business on Sunday than on any other day. The place was crowded with men in their rough, though picturesque, bandit-like costumes, rambling about from store to store, drinking and inviting friends to drink, or losing in the gaming saloons all the earnings of a week of hard, steady toil more severe than is that of navvies or coal heavers. There seemed to be an irresistible attraction in these gambling houses. Some men seemed unable to withstand the temptation, and they seldom escaped being fleeced. Yet they returned, week after week, to waste in these dens of iniquity the golden treasure gathered with so much labour during their 6 working days. Larry O'Neil looked through the doorway of one of the gambling houses as he passed, and saw men standing and sitting round the tables, watching with eager faces the progress of the play, while ever and anon one of them would reel out, more than half drunk with excitement and brandy. Passing on through the crowded part of the village, which looked as if a fair were being held there, he entered the narrow footpath that led towards the deeper recesses at the head of the valley. O'Neil had not yet, since his arrival, found time to wander far from his own tent. It was, therefore, with a feeling of great delight that he left the scene of riot behind him, and, turning into a by path that led up one of the narrow ravines opening into the larger valley, strolled several miles into deep solitudes that were in harmony with his feelings. The sun streamed through the entrance to this ravine, bathing with a flood of light crags and caves and bush-encompassed hollows that at other times were shrouded in gloom. As the Irishman stood gazing in awe and admiration at the wild, beautiful scene, beyond which were seen the snowy peaks of the Sierra Nevada, he observed a small, solitary tent, pitched on a level patch of earth at the brow of a low cliff. Curiosity prompted him to advance and ascertain what unsociable creature dwelt in it. A few minutes sufficed to bring him close upon it, and he was about to step forward, when the sound of a female voice arrested him. It was soft and low, and the accents fell upon his ear with the power of an old familiar song. Being at the back of the tent, he could not see who spoke, but from the monotonous regularity of the tone he knew that the woman was reading. He passed noiselessly around to the front, and, peeping over the tops of bushes, obtained a view of the interior. The reader was a young woman, whose face, which was partially concealed by a mass of light brown hair as she bent over her book, seemed emaciated and pale. Looking up, just as Larry's eye fell upon her, she turned towards a man whose gaunt, attenuated form lay motionless on a pile of brushwood beside her, and said tenderly, "Are you tired, Patrick, dear, or would you like me to go on?" Larry's heart gave his ribs such a thump at that moment that he felt surprised the girl did not hear it. But he could not approach. He was rooted to the earth as firmly, though not as permanently, as the bush behind which he stood. An Irish voice, and an Irish girl, heard and seen so unexpectedly, quite took away his breath. The sick man made some reply which was not audible, and the girl, shutting the book, looked up for a few moments as if in silent prayer. Then she clasped her hands upon her knees, and, laying her head upon them, remained for some time motionless. The hands were painfully thin, as was her whole frame. The face was what might have been pretty at one time, although it was haggard enough now, but the expression was peculiarly sorrowful. In a few minutes she looked up again, and spread the ragged blanket more carefully over the shoulders of the sick man, and Larry, feeling that he was at that time in the questionable position of an eavesdropper, left his place of concealment and stood before the tent. The sick man saw him instantly, and, raising himself slightly, exclaimed, "Who goes there? Sure I can't get lave to die in pace." The familiar tones of a countryman's voice fell pleasantly on Larry's ear as he sprang into the tent, and, seizing the sick man's hand, cried, "A blessing on the mouth that said that same! Oh, Pat, darlint, I'm glad to mate with ye. What's the matter with ye? Tell me now, and don't be looking as if you'd seen a ghost." "Keep back," said the girl, pushing Larry aside, with a half pleased, half angry expression. "Don't you see that you almost made him faint? He's too wake and turly to be. Oh, then, cushla, forgive me. I wint and forgot meself. Blessings on your pale face. Sure, you're Irish too." Before the girl could reply to this speech, which was uttered in a tone of the deepest sympathy, the sick man recovered sufficiently to say, "Sit down, friend. How comed you to learn me name? I guess I never saw you before." "Sure, didn't I hear your wife say it as I came for'ard to the tint?" answered Larry, somewhat staggered at the un-Irish word guess. "Hay's my brother," remarked the girl. "Troth, you've got a dash of the Yankee brogue," said Larry, with a puzzled look. "Did you not come from the old country?" The sick man seemed too much exhausted to reply, so the girl said, "Our father and mother were Irish, and left their own country to settle in America. We have never seen Ireland, my brother nor I, but we think of it as almost our own land, having been brought up in the woods, and seeing almost no one but father and mother for days and weeks at a time. We've got a good deal of the Irish tongue." "Ah, then you have raison to be thankful for that same," remarked Larry, who was a little disappointed that his new friends were not altogether Irish; but, after a few minutes' consideration, he came to the conclusion that people whose father and mother were natives of the Emerald Isle could no more be Americans simply because they happened to be born in America than they could be fish if they chanced to be born at sea. Having settled this point to his satisfaction, he proceeded to question the girl as to their past history and the cause of their present sad condition, and gradually obtained from her the information that their father and mother were dead, and that, having heard of the mines of California, her brother had sold off his farm in the backwoods, and proceeded by the overland route to the new land of gold, in company with many other western hunters and farmers. They reached it, after the most inconceivable sufferings, in the beginning of winter, and took up their abode at Little Creek. The rush of emigration from the western states to California by the overland route, that took place at this time, was attended with the most appalling sufferings and loss of life. Men sold off their snug farms, packed their heavy waggons with the necessaries for a journey, with their wives and little ones, over a wilderness more than 2,000 miles in extent, and set off by scores over the prairies toward the ultimate Thule of the far west. The first part of their journey was prosperous enough, but the weight of their waggons rendered the pace slow, and it was late in the season ere they reached the great barrier of the Rocky Mountains. But severe although the sufferings of those first emigrants were, they were as nothing compared with the dire calamities that befell those who started from home later in the season. All along the route the herbage was cropped bare by those who had gone before. Their oxen broke down. Burning, sandy deserts presented themselves when the wretched travellers were well nigh exhausted, and when at length they succeeded in reaching the great mountain chain, its dark passes were filled with the ice and snow of early winter. Hundreds of men, women, and children fell down and died on the burning plain, or clambered up the rugged heights to pillow their dying heads at last on wreaths of snow. To add to the unheard of miseries of these poor people, scurvy in its worst forms attacked them, and the air of many of their camping places was heavy with the stench arising from the dead bodies of men and animals that had perished by the way. "It was late in the season," said Kate Morgan, as Larry's new friend was named, "when me brother Patrick and I set off with our waggon and oxen, and my little sister Nelly, who was just able to run about with her curly yellow hair streaming over her purty shoulders, and her laughing blue eyes almost spaking when they looked at you." The poor girl spoke with deep pathos as she mentioned Nelly's name, while Larry O'Neil sat with his hands clasped, gazing at her with an expression of the deepest commiseration. "We got pretty well on at first," she continued, after a pause, "because our waggon was lighter than most of the others, but it was near winter before we got to the mountains, and then our troubles begood. First of all, one of the oxen fell and broke its leg. Then darlin' Nelly fell sick, and Patrick had to carry her on his back up the mountains, for I had got so wake meself that I wasn't fit to take her up. All the way over I was troubled with one of the emigrants that kep' us company. There was 30 of us altogether. He was a very bad man, and none of us liked him. He took a fancy to me, and asked me to be his wife so often that I had to make Patrick order him to kape away from us altogether. He went off in a black rage, swearing he'd be revenged, and oh," continued Kate, wringing her hands, "he kept his word. One day there was a dispute between our leaders which way we should go, for we had got to 2 passes in the mountains, so one party went one way, and we went another. Through the night my lover came into our camp to wish me good bye, he said, for the last time, as he was going with the other party. After he was gone, I missed Nelly, and went out to seek for her among the tents of my neighbours, but she was nowhere to be found. At once I guessed he had taken her away, for well did he know I would sooner have lost my life than my own darlin' Nell." Again the girl paused a few moments, then she resumed in a low voice, "We never saw him or Nelly again. It is said the whole party perished, and I believe it, for they were far spent, and the road they took, I've been told, is worse than the one we took. It was dead winter when we arrived, and Patrick and me came to live here. We made a good deal at first by digging, but we both fell sick of the ague, and we've been scarce able to kape us alive till now, but it won't last long. Dear Patrick is broken down entirely, as you see, and I haven't strength a'most to go down to the diggings for food. I haven't been there for a month, and it's 4 miles away, as I dare say you know. We'll both be at rest soon." "Ah, now, don't say that again," cried Larry, smiting his thigh with energy. "You'll be nothin' o' the sort, that you won't. Sure your brother Pat is slapin' now like an infant, he is, and I'll go down myself to the stores and get you medicines, and a doctor, and what not. Cheer up now." Larry's enthusiastic efforts to console his new friend were interrupted by the sick man, who awoke at the moment and whispered the word "food." His sister rose, and taking up a small tin pan that simmered on the fire in front of the tent, poured some of its contents into a dish. "What is it you give him?" inquired Larry, taking the dish from the girl's hands and putting it to his lips. He instantly spat out the mouthful, for it was soup made of rancid pork, without vegetables of any kind. "'Tis all I've got left," said the girl. "Even if I was able to go down for more, he wouldn't let me. But I couldn't. for I've tried more than once and near died on the road. Besides, I haven't a grain of gold in the tent." "Oh, mother! 'Tarrin' ages!" cried Larry, staring first at the girl and then at her brother, while he slapped his thighs and twisted his fingers together as if he wished to wrench them out of joint. "Howld on! Faix, I'll do it. Don't give it him, plaise. Howld on, do." Larry O'Neil turned round as he spoke, seized his cudgel, sprang right over the bushes in front of the tent, and in 2 minutes more was seen far down the ravine, spurning the ground beneath him as if life and death depended on the race. CHAPTER 12. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 13. Kindness to Strangers in Distress. Remarks in reference to early rising. Diggings wax unproductive. Ned takes a ramble and has a small adventure. Plans formed and partly developed. Remarkable human creatures discovered, and still more remarkable converse held with them. "I'll trouble ye for 2 pounds of flour," cried Larry O'Neil, dashing into one of the stores, which was thronged with purchasers, whom he thrust aside rather unceremoniously. "You'll have to take your turn, stranger, I calculate," answered the storekeeper, somewhat sharply. "Ah, then, plaise do attend to me at once, for sure I've run 4 miles to get stuff for a dyin' family. Won't ye now?" The earnest manner in which Larry made this appeal was received with a laugh by the bystanders, and a recommendation to the storekeeper to give him what he wanted. "What's the price?" inquired Larry, as the man measured it out. $2 a pound," answered the man. "Musha! I've sayed it chaper." "I guess so have I; but provisions are getting up, for nothing has come from Sacramento for a fortnight. Tay and sugar'll be as bad, no doubt." "Worse they are, for there's next to none at all, I opine, in this here location." "Faix, I'll have a pound of both, if they was $2 the half ounce. Have ye got raisins and sago?" "Yes." "Give me a pound of that aich." These articles having been delivered and paid for, Larry continued, "You'll have brandy, of course?" "I guess I have. Plenty, at $20 a bottle." "Och, mother! It'll break the bank entirely; but it's little I care. Hand me 1 bottle, plaise." The bottle of brandy was added to his store, and then the Irishman, shouldering his bundle of good things, left the shop, and directed his steps once more towards the ravine in which dwelt Kate Morgan and her brother Pat. It was late when the Irishman returned from his mission of kindness, and he found the fire nearly out, the tent closed, and all his comrades sound asleep, so, gently lifting the curtain that covered the entrance, he crept quietly in, lay down beside Bill Jones, whose nasal organ was performing a trombone solo, and in 5 minutes was sound asleep. It seemed to him as if he had barely closed his eyes when he was roused by his comrades making preparations to resume work. Nevertheless, he had rested several hours, and the grey hue of early day that streamed in through the opening of the tent warned him that he must recommence the effort to realise his golden dreams. The pursuit of gold, however engrossing it may be, does not prevent men from desiring to lie still in the morning, or abate 1 jot of the misery of their condition when they are rudely roused by early comrades, and told that "it's time to get up." Larry O'Neil, Tom Collins, and Maxton groaned on receiving this information from Ned, turned, and made as if they meant to go to sleep. But they meant nothing of the sort. It was merely a silent testimony to the fact of their thorough independence, an expressive way of showing that they scorned to rise at the bidding of any man, and that they would not get up till it pleased themselves to do so. That this was the case became evident from their groaning again 2 minutes afterwards, and turning round on their backs. Then they stretched themselves, and sitting up, stared at each other like owls. A moment after, Maxton yawned vociferously and fell back again quite flat, an act which was instantly imitated by the other two. Such is the force of bad example. By this time the captain and Jones had left the tent, and Ned Sinton was buckling on his belt. "Now, then, get up, and don't be lazy," cried the latter, as he stepped out, dragging all the blankets off the trio as he took his departure, an act which disclosed the fact that trousers and flannel shirts were the sleeping garments of Maxton and Tom, and that Larry had gone to bed in his boots. The three sprang up immediately, and, after performing their toilets, sallied forth to the banks of the stream, where the whole population of the place was already hard at work. Having worked out their claims, which proved to be pretty good, they commenced new diggings close beside the old ones, but these turned out complete failures, excepting that selected by Captain Bunting, which was as rich as the first. The gold deposits were in many places very irregular in their distribution, and it frequently happened that one man took out $30 or $40 a day from his claim, while another man, working within a few yards of him, was, to use a mining phrase, unable to raise the colour, that is, to find gold enough to repay his labour. This uncertainty disgusted many of the impatient gold hunters, and not a few returned home, saying that the finding of gold in California was a mere lottery, who, if they had exercised a little patience and observation, would soon have come to know the localities in which gold was most likely to be found. There is no doubt whatever that the whole country is impregnated more or less with the precious material. The quartz veins in the mountains are full of it, and although the largest quantities are usually obtained in the beds of streams and on their banks, gold is to be found in smaller quantities even on the tops of the hills. Hitherto the miners at Little Creek had found the diggings on the banks of the stream sufficiently remunerative, but the discovery of several lumps of gold in its bed induced many of them to search for it in the shallow water, and they were successful. One old sea captain was met by Bill Jones with a nugget the size of a goose egg in each hand, and another man found a single lump of almost pure gold that weighed 14 pounds. These discoveries induced Ned Sinton to think of adopting a plan which had been in his thoughts for some time past, so one day he took up his rifle, intending to wander up the valley, for the double purpose of thinking out his ideas, and seeing how the diggers higher up got on. As he sauntered slowly along, he came to a solitary place, where no miners were at work, in consequence of the rugged nature of the banks of the stream rendering the labour severe. Here, on a projecting cliff, which overhung a deep dark pool, or eddy, he observed the tall form of a naked man, whose brown skin bespoke him the native of a southern clime. While Ned looked at him, wondering what he could be about, the man suddenly bent forward, clasped his hands above his head, and dived into the pool. Ned ran to the margin immediately, and stood for nearly a minute observing the dark, indistinct form of the savage as he groped along the bottom. Suddenly he rose, and made for the shore with a nugget of gold in his hand. He seemed a little disconcerted on observing Ned, who addressed him in English, French, and Spanish, but without eliciting any reply save a grunt. This, however, did not surprise our hero, who recognised the man to be a Sandwich Islander, whom he had met before in the village, and whose powers of diving were well known to the miners. He ascertained by signs, however, that there was much gold at the bottom of the stream, which doubtless the diver could not detach from the rocks during the short period of his immersion, so he hastened back to the tent, determined to promulgate his plan to his comrades. It was noon when he arrived, and the miners were straggling from all parts of the diggings to the huts, tents, and restaurants. "Ha! Maxton, glad I found you alone," cried Ned, seating himself on an empty box before the fire, over which the former was engaged in culinary operations. "I have been thinking over a plan for turning the course of the stream, and so getting at a portion of its bed." "Now that's odd," observed Maxton. "I have been thinking of the very same thing all morning." "Indeed? Wits jump, they say. I fancied that I had the honour of first hitting on the plan." "First hitting on it!" rejoined Maxton, smiling. "My dear fellow, it has not only been hit upon, but hit off many months ago, with considerable success in some parts of the diggings. The only thing that prevents it being generally practised is, that men require to work in companies, for the preliminary labour is severe, and miners seem to prefer working singly, or in twos and threes, as long as there is good pay dirt on the banks." "Well, then, the difficulty does not affect us, because we are already a pretty strong company, although our vaquero has left us. And I have seen a place this morning which I think will do admirably to begin upon. It is a deep pool a few miles up the stream under " "I know it," interrupted Maxton, putting a large slice of pork into the frying pan, which hissed delightfully in the ears of hungry men. "I know the place well, but there is a much better spot not a quarter of a mile higher up, where a Chinaman named Ah wow lives. It will be more suitable, you'll find, when I show it you." "We'll go and have a look at it after dinner," observed Ned. "Meanwhile, here are our comrades. Let us hear what they have to say about the proposal." As he spoke, Collins, Jones, Larry, and the captain advanced in single file, and with disconsolate looks, that told of hard toil and little reward. "Well, what have you got, comrades?" "Nothin'," answered Bill Jones, drawing forth his comforter. Bill's comforter was black and short, and had a bowl, and was at all times redolent of tobacco. "Niver a speck," cried Larry O'Neil, setting to with energy to assist in preparing dinner. "Well, friends, I've a plan to propose to you, so let us take the edge off our appetites, and I'll explain." Ned sat down tailor fashion on the ground with his companions round him, and while they devoted themselves ravenously and silently to tea, flour cake, salt pork, and beans, he explained to them the details of his plan, which explanation, if it was not the dinner, had the effect of raising their spirits greatly. Instead, therefore, of repairing to their profitless claims after dinner, they went in a body up the stream to visit the Chinaman's diggings. Captain Bunting alone remained behind, as his claim was turning out a first-rate one. "Sure, there's a human!" cried Larry, as they turned a projecting point about an hour and a half later, and came in sight of Ah wow's "location," as the Yankees termed it. "It may be a human," remarked Ned, laughing, "but it's the most inhuman one I ever saw. I think yonder fellow must be performing a surgical operation on the Chinaman's head." Ah wow was seated on a stone in front of his own log hut, with his arms resting on his knees, and an expression of supreme felicity on his yellow face, while a countryman, in what appeared a nightgown, and an immense straw hat, dressed his tail for him. Lest uninformed readers should suppose that Ah wow belonged to the monkey tribe, we may mention that the Chinaman's head was shaved quite bald all round, with the exception of a tail of hair, about 2 feet long, and upwards of an inch thick, which jutted from the top of his caput, and hung down his back. This tail he was in the act of getting dressed when our party of miners broke in upon the privacy of his dressing room. Ah wow had a nose which was very flat and remarkably broad, with the nostrils pointing straight to the front. He also had a mouth which was extremely large, frightfully thick-lipped, and quite the reverse of pretty. He had 2 eyes also, not placed like the eyes of ordinary men across his face, on either side of his nose, but set in an angular manner on his visage, so that the outer corners pointed a good deal upwards, and the inner corners pointed a good deal downwards, towards the point of his nose, or rather towards that vacant space in front of his nostrils, which would have been the point of his nose, if that member had had a point at all. Ah wow also had cheek bones which were uncommonly high, and a forehead which was preposterously low, and a body which was rather squat, and a tout ensemble which was desperately ugly. Like his hairdresser, he wore a coat somewhat resembling a nightshirt, with a belt around it, and his feet were thrust into yellow slippers. These last, when he went to dig for gold, he exchanged for heavy boots. When Ned and his friends walked up and stood in a grinning row before him, Ah wow opened his little eyes to the uttermost, which wasn't much, and said, "How?" If he had affixed "do you do" to it, the sentence would have been complete and intelligible. His companion attempted to vary the style of address by exclaiming, "Ho!" "Can you speak English?" inquired Ned, advancing. A shake of the head, and a consequent waggle of the tail, was the reply. "Or French?" "Shake and waggle." "Maybe you can do Irish," suggested Larry. The shake and waggle were more vigorous than before. But Ah wow rose, and, drawing on his boots, made signs to his visitors to follow him, which they did through the bushes round the base of a steep precipice. A short walk brought them to an open space quite close to the banks of the stream, which at that place was broken by sundry miniature waterfalls and cascades, whose puny turmoil fell like woodland music on the air. Here was another log hut of minute dimensions and ruinous aspect, in front of which sat another Chinaman eating his dinner. Him Ah wow addressed as Ko sing. After a brief conversation, Ko sing turned to the strangers and said, "Ho! Can speak English, me can. What you want?" "We want to look at your diggings," answered Ned. "We are going to turn the river here, if we can, and if you and your companions choose to join us, we will give you good wages." "Can speak, but not very well understand. Work you say, and pay we?" "Yes, that's it. You work for us, and we'll pay you." "How much?" inquired the cautious Celestial. $5 a day," replied Ned. The Chinaman put on a broad grin, and offered to shake hands, which offer was accepted, not only by Ned but by the whole party, and the contract was thus settled on the spot to the satisfaction of all parties. After this they spent some time in examining the bed of the stream, and having fixed upon a spot on which to commence operations, they prepared about sunset to return for their tent and mining tools, intending to make a moonlight flitting, in order to avoid being questioned by over curious neighbours. All their horses and mules, except Ned's charger, having been sold a few days before to a Yankee who was returning to Sacramento, they expected to get off without much noise, with their goods and chattels on their backs. Before starting on their return, while the rest of the party were crowding round and questioning Ko sing, Bill Jones, whose mind, since he arrived in California, seemed to be capable of only one sensation, that of surprise, went up to Ah wow, and glancing round, in order to make sure that he was not observed, laid his hand on his shoulder and looked inquiringly into the Chinaman's face. The Chinaman returned the compliment with interest, throwing into his sallow countenance an expression of, if possible, blanker astonishment. "Oh, wow!" said Bill, with solemn gravity, and pausing, as if to give him time to prepare for what was coming. "Oh, wow! What do you dress your pigtail with?" "Ho?" replied the Chinaman. "Ho!" echoed Bill. "Now that's curious. I thought as how you did it with grease, for it looks like it. Tell me now, how long did it take afore it growed that long?" He lifted the end of the tail as he spoke. "How?" ejaculated the Chinaman. "Ay, how long?" repeated Bill. We regret that we cannot give Ah wow's answer to this question, seeing that it was never given, in consequence of Bill being suddenly called away by Ned Sinton, as he and his friends turned to go. "Come, Bill, let's be off." "Ay, ay, sir," answered Bill, turning from the Chinaman, and following his comrades with solemn stolidity, or, if you prefer the expression, with stolid solemnity. "Don't linger, Larry," shouted Tom Collins. "Ah, then, it's cruel to tear me away. Good night to ye, Bow wow. We'll be back before mornin', ye purty creature." With this affectionate farewell, Larry ran after his friends, and followed them down the banks of the tumbling stream towards the R'yal Bank o' Calyforny, which was destined that night, for a time at least, to close its doors. CHAPTER 13. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 14. The New Diggings. Bright Prospects. Great results spring from great exertions, even in California. Captain Bunting is seized with a great passion for solitary rambling, and has two desperate encounters, one with a man, the other with a bear. The part of the Little Creek diggings to which the gold hunters transported their camp was a wild, secluded spot, not much visited by the miners, partly on account of its gloomy appearance, and partly in consequence of a belief that the Celestials located there were getting little or no gold. In this supposition they were correct. Ah wow and Ko sing, being inveterately lazy, contented themselves with digging just enough gold to enable them to purchase a sufficiency of the necessaries of life. But the region was extremely rich, as our adventurers found out very soon after their arrival. One of the ravines, in particular, gave indications of being full of gold, and several panfuls of earth that were washed out shewed so promising a return that the captain and Larry were anxious to begin at once. They were overruled, however, by the others, who wished to make trial of the bed of the stream. 6 days of severe labour were undergone by the whole party ere their task was accomplished, during which period they did not make an ounce of gold, while, at the same time, their little store was rapidly melting away. Nevertheless, they worked heartily, knowing that a few days of successful digging would amply replenish their coffers. At grey dawn they set to work, some, with trousers tucked up, paddling about in the water all day, carrying mud and stones, while others felled trees and cut them into logs, wherewith to form the dam required to turn the stream from its course. This was a matter of no small difficulty. A new bed had to be cut to the extent of 8 or 10 yards, but for a long time the free and jovial little mountain stream scorned to make such a pitiful twist in its course, preferring to burst its way headlong through the almost completed barricade by which it was pent up. Twice did it accomplish this feat, and twice, in so doing, did it sweep Captain Bunting off his legs and roll him along bodily, in a turmoil of mud and stones and dirty water, roaring as it gushed forth as if in savage triumph. On the second occasion Bill Jones shared the captain's ducking, and all who chanced to be working about the dam at the time were completely drenched. But however much their bodies might be moistened, no untoward accident could damp the ardour of their spirits. They resumed work again, repaired the breach, and finally turned the obstinate stream out of the course which, probably, it had occupied since creation. It rushed hissing, as if spitefully, along its new bed for a few yards, and then darted, at a right angle, back into its former channel, along which it leaped exultingly as before. But the object for which all this trouble had been undertaken was attained. About 8 yards of the old bed of the torrent were laid bare, and the water was drained away, whereat each of the party exhibited his satisfaction after his own peculiar manner, Larry O'Neil, as usual, giving vent to his joy in a hearty cheer. The result was even more successful than had been anticipated. During the next few days the party conversed little, their whole energies being devoted to eating, sleeping, and digging. The bed of the stream was filled with stones, among which they picked up numerous nuggets of various sizes, from a pea to a walnut, some being almost pure gold, while others were more or less mixed with quartz. A large quantity of the heavy black sand was also found at the bottom of a hole, which once had been an eddy. It literally sparkled with gold dust, and afforded a rich return for the labour previously expended in order to bring it to light. The produce of the first 2 days' work was no less than 14 pounds weight of gold. The third day was the Sabbath, and they rested from their work. It is, however, impossible for those who have never been in similar circumstances to conceive how difficult it was for our party of gold hunters to refrain from resuming work as usual on that morning. Some of them had never been trained to love or keep the Sabbath, and would have certainly gone to work had not Ned and the captain remonstrated. All were under great excitement in consequence of their valuable discovery, and anxious to know whether the run of luck was likely to continue, and not one of the party escaped the strong temptation to break the Sabbath day, except, indeed, the Chinamen, who were too easy going and lazy to care whether they worked or rested. But the inestimable advantage of good early training told at this time on Ned Sinton. It is questionable whether his principles were strong enough to have carried him through the temptation, but Ned had been trained to reverence the Lord's day from his earliest years, and he looked upon working on the Sabbath with a feeling of dread which he could not have easily shaken off, even had he tried. The promise in his case was fulfilled. Train up a child in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it when he is old. And though no mother's voice of warning was heard in that wild region of the earth, and no guardian's hand was there to beckon back the straggler from the paths of rectitude, yet he was not let alone. The arm of the Lord was around him, and his voice whispered, in tones that could not be misunderstood, "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy." We have already said that the Sabbath at the mines was a day of rest as far as mere digging went, but this was simply for the sake of resting the wearied frame, not from a desire to glorify God. Had any of the reckless miners who filled the gambling houses been anxious to work during Sunday on a prolific claim, he would not have hesitated because of God's command. The repose to their overworked muscles, and the feeling that they had been preserved from committing a great sin, enabled the party to commence work on Monday with a degree of cheerfulness and vigour that told favourably on their profits that night, and in the course of a few days they dug out gold to the extent of nearly 2000 pounds sterling. "We're goin' to git rich, no doubt of it," said the captain one morning to Ned, as the latter was preparing to resume work in the creek. "But I'll tell you what it is, I'm tired of salt beef and pork, and my old hole is getting rheumatic with paddling about barefoot in the water, so I mean to go off for a day's shooting in the mountains." "Very good, captain," replied Ned, "but I fear you'll have to go by yourself, for we must work out this claim as fast as we can, seeing that the miners further down won't be long of scenting out our discovery." Ned's words were prophetic. In less than half an hour after they were uttered, a long-visaged Yankee, in a straw hat, nankeen trousers, and fisherman's boots, came to the spot where they were at work, and seated himself on the trunk of a tree hard by, to watch their proceedings. "Guess you've got something," he said, as Larry, after groping in the mud for a little, picked up a lump of white quartz with a piece of gold the size of a marble embedded in the side of it. "Ah, but you're good for sore eyes," cried Larry, examining the nugget carefully. "I say, stranger," inquired the Yankee, "do you get many bits like that in this location?" The Irishman regarded his question with an expressive leer. "Arrah, no, you won't tell," he said in a hoarse whisper. "Sure, it'll be the death o' me av you do. There's no end o' them things here, as many as you'll like to pick. It's only the day before to morrow that I turned up a nugget of pure goold the size o' my head, and the captain got hold o' one that's only half dug out yet, and what's seen it is as big as the head o' a 5-gallon cask, all pure gold." The Yankee was not to be put off the scent by such a facetious piece of information. He continued to smoke in silence, sauntered about with his hands in his nankeen pockets, watched the proceedings of the party, inspected the dirt cast ashore, and finally dug out and washed a panful of earth from the banks of the stream, after which he threw away the stump of his cigar and went off whistling. 3 hours later he returned with a party of friends laden with tents, provisions, and mining tools, and they all took up their residence within 20 yards of our adventurers, and commenced to turn the course of the river just below them. Larry and Jones were at first so angry that they seriously meditated committing an assault upon the intruders, despite the remonstrances of Tom Collins and Maxton, who assured them that the new comers had a perfect right to the ground they occupied, and that any attempt to interrupt them by violence would certainly be brought under the notice of Judge Lynch, whose favourite punishments, they well knew, were whipping and hanging. Meanwhile, Captain Bunting had proceeded a considerable way on his solitary hunting expedition into the mountains, bent upon replenishing the larder with fresh provisions. He was armed with his favourite blunderbuss, a pocket compass, and a couple of ship biscuits. As he advanced towards the head of the valley, the scenery became more and more gloomy and rugged, but the captain liked this. Having spent the greater part of his life at sea, he experienced new and delightful sensations in viewing the mountain peaks and ravines by which he was now surrounded, and, although of a sociable turn of mind, he had no objection for once to be left to ramble alone, and give full vent to the feelings of romance and enthusiastic admiration with which his nautical bosom had been filled since landing in California. Towards noon the captain reached the entrance to a ravine or gorge which opened upon the larger valley, into which it discharged a little stream from its dark bosom. There was an air of deep solitude and rugged majesty about this ravine that induced the wanderer to pause before entering it. Just then certain sensations reminded him of the 2 biscuits in his pocket, so he sat down on a rock and prepared to dine. We say prepared to dine advisedly, for Captain Bunting had a pretty correct notion of what comfort meant, and how it was to be attained. He had come out for the day to enjoy himself, and although his meal was frugal, he did not on that account eat it in an off-hand, easy way, while sauntering along, as many would have done. By no means. He brushed the surface of the rock on which he sat quite clean, and, laying the 2 biscuits on it, looked first at one and then at the other complacently, while he slowly and with great care cut his tobacco into delicate shreds, and filled his pipe. Then he rose, and taking the tin prospecting pan from his belt, went and filled it at the clear rivulet which murmured at his feet, and placed it beside the biscuits on the rock. This done, he completed the filling of his pipe, and cast a look of benignity at the sun, which at that moment appeared in his course to pass an opening between 2 lofty peaks, which permitted him to throw a cloth of gold over the captain's table. Captain Bunting's mind now became imbued with those aspirations after knowledge which would have induced him, had he been at sea, to inquire, "How's her head?" So he pulled out his pocket compass, and having ascertained that his nose, when turned towards the sun, pointed exactly south-south-west and by south, he began dinner. Thereafter he lit his pipe, and, reclining on the green turf beside the rock, with his head resting on his left hand, and wreaths of smoke encircling his visage, he enjoyed himself. To elaborate a description, reader, often weakens it. We cannot say more than that he enjoyed himself emphatically. Had Captain Bunting known who was looking at him in that solitary place, he would not have enjoyed himself quite so much, nor would he have smoked his pipe so comfortably. On the summit of the precipice at his back stood, or rather sat, one of the natives of the country in the shape of a grizzly bear. Bruin had observed the captain from the time he appeared at the entrance of the ravine, and had watched him with a curious expression of stupid interest during all his subsequent movements. He did not attempt to interrupt him in his meal, however, on 2 grounds. First, because the nature of the grizzly bear, if not molested, induces him to let others alone, and secondly, because the precipice on the top of which he sat, although conveniently close for the purposes of observation, was too high for a safe jump. Thus it happened that Captain Bunting finished his meal in peace, and went on his way up the wild ravine, without being aware of the presence of so dangerous a spectator. He had not proceeded far, when his attention was arrested by the figure of a man, seated on a ledge of rock that overhung a yawning gulf into which the little stream plunged. So still did the figure remain, with the head drooping on the chest, as if in deep contemplation, that it might have been mistaken for a statue cut out of the rock on which it sat. A deep shadow was cast over it by the neighbouring mountain peaks, yet, as the white sheet of a waterfall formed the background, it was distinctly visible. The captain advanced towards it with some curiosity, and it was not until he was within 100 yards that a movement at length proved it to be a living human being. The stranger rose hastily, and advanced to meet a woman, who at the same time issued from an opening in the brushwood near him. The meeting was evidently disagreeable to the woman, although, from the manner of it and the place, it did not seem to be accidental. She pushed the man away several times, but their words were inaudible to the captain, who began to feel all the discomfort of being an unintentional observer. Uncertainty as to what he should do induced him to remain for a few moments inactive, and he had half made up his mind to endeavour to retreat unobserved, when the man suddenly struck down the female, who fell with a faint cry to the earth. In another minute the captain was at the side of the dastardly fellow, whom he seized by the neck with the left hand, while with the right he administered a hearty blow to his ribs. The man turned round fiercely and grappled with his assailant, and then Captain Bunting became aware that his antagonist was no other than Smith, alias Black Jim, the murderer. Smith, although a strong man, was no match for the captain, who soon overpowered him. "Ha, you villain, have I got you?" cried he, as he almost throttled the man. "Get up now, and come along peaceably. If you don't, I'll knock your brains out with the butt of my gun." He permitted Black Jim to rise as he spoke, but held him fast by the collar, having previously taken from him his knife and rifle. Black Jim did not open his lips, but the scowl on his visage showed that feelings of deadly hatred burned in his bosom. Meanwhile the girl had recovered, and now approached. "Ah, please, sir," she said, "let him off. Sure, I don't mind the blow. It's done me no harm. Won't you now?" "Let him off!" exclaimed the captain violently. "No, my good girl. If he has not murdered you, he has at any rate murdered one human being that I know of. and if I can, I'll bring him to justice." Kate, for it was she, started at this reply, and looked earnestly at the man, who hung his head, and for the first time showed symptoms of a softer feeling. "Ah, it's true, I see, and all hope is gone. If he'd commit a murder, he'd tell a lie too. I thought he spoke truth when he said Nelly was alive, but—" The girl turned as she spoke, and left the spot hurriedly, while the captain took out his pocket handkerchief and began to fasten the arms of his prisoner behind him. But Black Jim was not to be secured without a struggle. Despair lent him energy and power. Darting forward, he endeavoured to throw his captor down, and partially succeeded; but Captain Bunting's spirit was fully roused, and, like most powerful men whose dispositions are habitually mild and peaceful, he was in a blaze of uncontrollable passion. For some time Black Jim writhed like a serpent in the strong grasp of his antagonist, and once or twice it seemed as if he would succeed in freeing himself, but the captain's hands had been trained for years to grasp and hold on with vice-like tenacity, and no efforts could disengage them. The two men swayed to and fro in their efforts, no sound escaping them, save an occasional gasp for breath, as they put forth renewed energy in the deadly struggle. At last Black Jim began to give way. He was forced down on one knee, then he fell heavily on his side, and the captain placed his knee on his chest. Just then a peculiar hiss was heard behind them, and the captain, looking back, observed that a third party had come upon the scene. The grizzly bear, which has been described as watching Captain Bunting at dinner, had left its former position on the brow of the precipice, and, whether from motives of curiosity or by accident, we will not presume to say, had followed the captain's track. It now stood regarding the two men with an uncommonly ferocious aspect. Its indignation may perhaps be accounted for by the fact that they stood in the only path by which it could advance, a precipice on one side and a thicket on the other, rendering the passage difficult or impossible. Grizzlies are noted for their objection to turn out of their way for man or beast, so the combatants no sooner beheld the ferocious looking animal than they sprang up, seized their weapons, and fired together at their common enemy. Bruin shook his head, uttered a savage growl, and charged. It seemed as if Black Jim had missed altogether, not to be wondered at considering the circumstances, and the mixture of shot and slugs from the blunderbuss was little more hurtful than a shower of hail to the thick-skinned monarch of these western hills. Be this as it may, the two men were compelled to turn and flee for their lives. Black Jim, being the nimbler of the two, was soon out of sight among the rocks of the precipices, and, we may remark in passing, he did not again make his appearance. Inwardly thanking the bear for its timely appearance, he ran at top speed into the mountains, and hid himself among those wild, lonely recesses that are visited but rarely by man or beast. Captain Bunting endeavoured to save himself by darting up the face of the precipice on his left, but the foothold was bad, and the bear proved about as nimble as himself, compelling him to leap down again and make for the nearest tree. In doing so he tripped over a fallen branch, and fell with stunning violence to the ground. He rose, however, instantly, and grasping the lower limb of a small oak, drew himself with some difficulty up among the branches. The bear came thundering on, and reached the tree a few seconds later. It made several abortive efforts to ascend, and then, sitting down at the foot, it looked up, grinning and growling horribly in disappointed rage. The captain had dropped the blunderbuss in his fall, and now, with deep regret and not a little anxiety, found himself unarmed and a prisoner. True, his long knife was still in its place, but he was too well aware of the strength and ferocity of the grizzly bear, from hearsay and now from ocular demonstration, to entertain the idea of acting on the offensive with such a weapon. The sun sank behind the mountain peaks, and the shades of night began to fall upon the landscape, and still did Captain Bunting and the bear sit, the one at the top and the other at the foot of the oak tree, looking at each other. As darkness came on, the form of the bear became indistinct and shadowy, and the captain's eyes waxed heavy from constant staring and fatigue, so that at length Bruin seemed to the alarmed fancy of the treed mariner to be twice the size of an elephant. At last the darkness became so deep that its form mingled with the shadows on the ground, and for some time the uncertainty as to its actual presence kept the prisoner wakeful. But soon his eyes began to close, despite his utmost efforts to keep them open, and for 2 hours he endured an agonising struggle with sleep, compared to which his previous struggle with Black Jim was mere child's play. He tried every possible position among the branches, in the hope of finding one in which he might indulge in sleep without the risk of falling, but no such position was to be found. The limbs of the tree were too small and too far apart. At last, however, he did find a spot to lie down on, and, with a sigh of relief, lay back to indulge in repose. Alas! the spot was a myth. He merely dreamed it. The next moment he dropped, like a huge over-ripe pear, to the ground. Fortunately a bush broke the violence of his fall, and, springing up with a cry of consternation, he rushed towards the tree, expecting each instant to feel the terrible hug of his ursine enemy. The very marrow in his backbone seemed to shrink, for he fancied that he actually felt the dreaded claws sinking into his flesh. In his haste he missed the branch, and fell violently forward, scratching himself terribly among the bushes. Again he rose, and a cold perspiration broke out upon him as he uttered an involuntary howl of terror, and once more leaped up at the limb of the oak, which he could just barely see. He caught it. Despair nerved him, and in another moment he was safe, and panting violently among the branches. We need scarcely say that this little episode gave his feelings such a tremendous shock that his tendency to sleep was thoroughly banished. But another and a better result flowed from it. The involuntary hubbub created by his yells and crashing falls reached listening and not far distant ears. During their evening meal that day, Ned Sinton and his comrades had speculated pretty freely, and somewhat jocularly, on the probable result of the captain's hunting expedition, expressing opinions regarding the powers of the blunderbuss, which it was a shame, Larry O'Neil said, to spake behind its back. But as night drew on they conversed more seriously, and when darkness had fairly set in, they became anxious. "It's quite clear that something's wrong," cried Ned Sinton, entering the tent hastily. "We must up and search for him. The captain's not the man to lose his way with a compass in his pocket and so many landmarks round him." All the party rose at once, and began to buckle on belts and arm, while eagerly suggesting plans of search. "Who can make a torch?" inquired Ned. "Here's one ready made to hand," cried Maxton, seizing a huge pine knot and lighting it. "Some one must stay behind to look after our things. The newcomers who camp beside us to day are not used to mining life, and don't sufficiently know the terrors of lynch law. Do you stop, Maxton. Now then, the rest of you, come along." Ned issued from the tent as he spoke, and walked at a rapid pace along the track leading up to the valley, followed closely by Tom Collins, Larry O'Neil, and Bill Jones, all of whom were armed with rifles, revolvers, and bowie knives. For a long time they walked on in silence, guided by the faint light of the stars, until they came to the flat rock which had formed the captain's dinner table. Here they called a halt, in order to discuss the probability of their lost comrade having gone up the ravine. The question was soon settled by Larry, who discovered a few crumbs of the biscuit lying on the rock, and footprints leading up the ravine, for the captain, worthy man, had stepped recklessly into the little stream when he went to fill his pannikin, and his wet feet left a distinct track behind him for some distance. "He can't have gone far up such a wild place as this," said Tom Collins, while they moved cautiously along. "Kindle the torch, Ned. It will light us on our way, and be a guide to the captain if he's within sight." "It will enlighten enemies, too, if any are within range," replied Ned, hesitating. "Oh, no fear," rejoined Tom. "Our greatest enemy is darkness. Here, Jones, hand me your match box." In a few seconds the torch flared, casting a broad glare of light on their path as they advanced, examining the foot of precipices. "Give a shout, Larry," said Ned. Larry obeyed, and all listened intently, but, save the echo from the wild cliffs, no reply was heard. Had the captain been wide awake at the time, he would doubtless have heard the friendly shout, but his ears were dull from prolonged watching. It was thought needless to repeat the cry, so the party resumed their search with anxious forebodings in their hearts, though their lips were silent. They had not proceeded far, however, when the noise occasioned by the captain's fall from the tree, as already described, struck upon their ears. "Och! What's that?" exclaimed Larry, with a look of mingled surprise and superstitious fear. For a minute the party seemed transformed into statues, as each listened intently to the mysterious sounds. "They come from the other side of the point ahead," remarked Ned in a whisper. "Light another torch, Larry, and come on. Quick!" Ned led the way at a run, holding one of the torches high above his head, and in a few minutes passed round the point above referred to. The glare of his torch immediately swept far ahead, and struck with gladsome beam on the now wakeful eye of the captain, who instantly greeted it with one of his own peculiarly powerful and eminently nautical roars. "Harroo!" yelled Larry in reply, dashing forward at full speed. "Here we are, all right, captain, comin' to the rescue. Don't give in, captain. Pitch into the blackguards." "Look out for the grizzly bear!" roared the captain, as his friends advanced at a run, waving their torches encouragingly. The whole party came to a dead halt on this unexpected caution, and each cocked his piece as they looked first into the gloom beyond, and then at each other, in surprise and perplexity. "Halloo! captain, where are you?" shouted Ned. "And where's the bear?" added Tom Collins. "Right in front o' you," replied the captain, "about 50 yards on. The bear's at the bottom o' the tree, and I'm atop of it. Come on and fire together, but aim low, d'ye hear?" "Ay, ay, sir," replied Bill Jones, as if he were answering a command on shipboard, while he advanced boldly in the direction indicated. The others were abreast of him instantly, Ned and Larry holding the torches high in their left hands as they approached, step by step, with rifles ready for instant use. "Have a care!" cried the captain. "I see him. He seems to be crouching to make a rush." This caused another halt, but as no rush was made, the party continued to advance, very slowly. "Oh, if ye would only show yourself!" said Larry, in a suppressed tone of exasperation at being kept so long in nervous expectation. "I see him," cried Ned, taking aim. The rest of the party cried "Where?" aimed in the same direction, and the whole fired a volley, the result of which was that Captain Bunting fell a second time to the ground, crashing through the branches with a terrible noise, and alighting heavily at the foot of the tree. To the surprise of all, he instantly jumped up, and seizing Ned and Tom as they came up, shook them warmly by the hand. "Och, are you not shot, captain?" exclaimed Larry. "Not a bit, not even hurt," answered the captain, laughing. The fact was that Captain Bunting, in his anxiety to escape being accidentally shot by his comrades, had climbed to the utmost possible height among the tender top branches of the oak. When the volley was fired, he lost his balance, fell through the tree, the under branches of which happily broke his fall, and finally alighted on the back of the grizzly bear itself, which lay extended and quite dead on the ground. "Faix, we've polished him off for once," cried Larry, in the excess of his triumph, as he stood looking at the fallen bear. "Faix, we've done nothing of the sort," retorted Tom Collins, who was examining the carcass. "It's been dead for hours, and is quite cold. Every bullet has missed, too, for the shot that settled him is on the side next the ground. So much for hasty shooting. Had Bruin been alive when we fired, I'm inclined to think that some of us would not be alive now." "Now that's what I was sure of," remarked Bill Jones. "What I says is this: when you're goin' aloft to reef topsails, don't be in a hurry. It's o' no manner o' use tryin' to shove on the wind. If you've got a thing to do, do it slow, slow and sure. If you haven't got a thing to do, in course you can't do it; but if you have, don't be in a hurry, I says." Bill Jones's maxim is undoubtedly a good one. Not a scratch had the bear received from any one of the party. The bullet of Black Jim had laid him low. Although hurriedly aimed, it had reached the animal's heart, and all the time that Captain Bunting was struggling to overcome his irresistible tendency to sleep, poor Bruin was lying a helpless and lifeless body at the foot of the oak tree. CHAPTER XV.